Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Regina Celestin Williams, and I am the Executive Director here at SB at Home. And we are very excited today to host you for a very thoughtful and informative conversation around what we can learn from San Jose's interim shelter model. So we're here at our Policy and Action at Home series. It is a monthly informal discussion convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month, we select a topic or current event, and we bring in an expert to give a brief presentation and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas of shared action. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, and Tamian Nation and Ama Mutsun, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We at SB at Home are committed to honoring and making visible the Indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. And now I'm going to move on to our ground rules. We want to ensure that the conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. So we ask that you please be kind and courteous to each other, and refrain from rude comments or personal attacks. We encourage asking questions and listening as we learn and engage with each other. Please remember that today's event is focused on redefining affordable housing and its role in ending homelessness, and really investigating the current interim shelter model that the city of San Jose is employing today. Please keep questions in the chat on topic. And sometimes the chat can get lively. If you find it distracting you from the content of the discussion, we do encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. If a person is disruptive or otherwise violates this code of conduct, they may be removed with or without warning. So with that, I just want to turn it over to our Director of Policy, Mathew Reed, as he introduces our guest speaker, Ragan Henninger, today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Regina. Welcome, everybody. We're so pleased to have you here this afternoon. And we're extremely excited to have Ragan Henninger come and talk to us about the work that's happening in San Jose. Ragan is the Deputy Director of the City of San Jose's Housing Department. She oversees the homeless programs and policy. And she's been doing this work for over 20 years. Prior to joining the Housing Department, Ragan was the Director of Policy and Budget for our last mayor, Mayor Sam Liccardo, and also worked for San Jose nonprofits in this area, Home First and Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence. Ragan, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have a presentation from you, and then we'll come back together and talk a little bit more. So thank you again.
Thanks, Mathew, and thanks to SB at Home for having me. It's nice to see so many friends and colleagues have joined, and I'm hoping to just breeze through the slides so we can have robust discussion. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Today, I would like to cover a few topics, a lot of ground to cover, but I'm hoping that there will be a couple of takeaways today. First is, how does interim housing fit in our community? Second, lessons learned from San Jose. We are not doing it perfect. We're always iterating and learning. And three, some regional resources and best practices. Next slide. So I like to start with just some background and context about who's homeless in our community. What are some of the driving factors? There are over 6,600 people experiencing homelessness in San Jose. Countywide, it's 9,900 people, 75% of which are living unsheltered in some pretty awful living conditions. Next slide. Some of the primary conditions that have led to a person's homelessness in our community. This data is from a survey that we do along with the point in time count. So you can see some of the primary conditions of why people experience homelessness in our community. Lost jobs, substance use, eviction, and divorce are top among them. Next slide. So the crisis of homelessness on our streets is not just about housing people, though this is obviously important. It's also about preventing homelessness in the first place. And this is really important in the context of interim housing and other shelter solutions, in that we will never be able to build enough interim housing or shelter or safe parking as long as the inflow of people becoming homeless for the first time drastically outpaces the people in our system who are permanently housing. So what this simple slide shows you is that right now in our system, for every one person that we permanently house, 2 to 3 more are becoming homeless and entering our homeless system for the very first time. And we call this inflow. Next slide. And why it's so important to address prevention through policy and programs is that it really addresses the systemic factors that are driving homelessness. So some of the systemic factors are, simply put, poverty. Homelessness is a symptom of poverty. In this table, we show that from 2000 to 2019, wages for people in the 90th income percentile increased 18%, while in that same time frame, wages for the lowest income workers actually decreased. And so simply put, what this is saying is that the gap between the rich and the poor is growing, and it means that people are not able to save money, and they're spending more and more money on rent. So any kind of unexpected expense can cause someone to experience homelessness. So again, those driving factors that I just mentioned: eviction, loss of a job, divorce, a physical health problem can result in homelessness. Next slide. Additionally, housing that's affordable to our lowest income families is not being built, creating a massive housing shortage for those most in need. So this slide shows that there are just 32 homes affordable to extremely low income households for every 100 families that qualify or are in need. This results in things like overcrowding, and again, unexpected expenses in overcrowding situations can result in an individual or family experiencing homelessness. Next slide. And then finally, another systemic factor is really longstanding racial inequities that continue to disproportionately affect people who become homeless in our community. This slide shows that people of color are dramatically more likely to become homeless than their white counterparts. Next slide. So in our region, we have a strategic plan that guides all of our work. It's called the Community Plan to End Homelessness. And this plan is built on 3 core strategies. The first is addressing the economic and societal causes of homelessness through systemic and policy change. And then strategy 2 really focuses on continuing to build capacity and provide a broad array of housing services, including building more extremely affordable housing and expanding capacity in our homeless prevention programs. And then the third strategy really seeks to serve people who are suffering right now, living outside in horrible conditions. And to address this crisis, we're really trying to increase temporary housing and shelter capacity, and other kinds of investments in basic needs and safety programs. So this is where interim housing fits in, is in this third strategy. And we have a goal in this third strategy to double the amount of temporary, interim, and shelter beds in our system. Next slide. Many communities across up and down the West Coast are really focusing right now on solutions for the unsheltered, and focusing on addressing a specific population, such as people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. You really have to focus on the other 2 sides of the system: prevention, crisis response, but also permanent housing. They all have to work together in a unified way. So prevention decreases that inflow that I just talked about. Crisis response is really meant to connect people to immediate support, and permanent housing is really what's going to end someone's homelessness. And it's really critical that our region continue to address all 3 aspects of this. Next slide. So this is a common thing that we talk a lot about in our system, is really defining what interim housing is. Our region doesn't have a unified definition of interim housing, but we do have some common elements. So the common elements you can see here on the slide. I'll give you an example of the different definitions. So the county's interim housing is temporary stays for individuals who have a predetermined exit destination through our coordinated entry system. So for example, someone who knows that they're going to move to a permanent supportive housing unit. The city, however, uses interim housing much more like a shelter. I like to call it shelter reimagined, with really intensive supportive services. And our referrals come from our street outreach teams. And HUD actually buckets interim housing with emergency shelter. And they have a whole separate definition for transitional housing, which is really 24-month stays, and people typically have a signed lease. So there's not a real common definition for interim housing, and it's something we're still iterating on in our own community. Next slide. So in San Jose, our interim housing, as I mentioned, functions as shelter. All our referrals or placements come from the city's street outreach teams, who are working in some of our largest encampments. And we have a variety of interim sites. They're not all tiny homes. Some of them are new construction modular buildings, which looks like what you see here in this photo. And we also use converted hotels as interim housing. So there's not one particular construction type for the city of San Jose, although I will say we are moving away from traditional tiny cabins or tiny homes, and more to a modular type construction where individuals have their own unit with an in-suite bathroom. Next slide. So in San Jose, we have just over 1,700 interim beds that are either built, under construction, or in some form of development. And as I mentioned, it includes hotels, tiny cabins, and that new construction modular building. Next slide. So in San Jose, we have a cross-departmental team that's focused on completing our goals for interim housing. The team works on site selection, looking at viability and practicality of sites. Site ownership matters for us. We've built on city-owned land. We've leased land at a low or no cost from other public partners like VTA and Caltrans. But ownership really does matter. A city-owned property can go faster because there's no lease negotiations involved. We also do site design, procurement, and contracting, and each site is unique for all of these things. Some sites are have philanthropic contributions that play into the design and the build type. So we've gotten donations in the past of the modular units. And then some sites also are designed by a community partner. For example, our home key projects, our hotels are rehabbed by community partners, and our new construction home key project is being built by our partners at Life Moves. Next slide. So other components the city team is focused on is project delivery, construction, and transitioning the sites to operations. Controlling costs is always front and center, especially with interest rates and just the cost of supplies rapidly increasing. And then another lesson learned, I would say, is staying on top of modular unit orders, their delivery, their installation. Those are really a critical path to preventing project delays. Next slide. So San Jose has really focused on a human-centered design for our site operations. Our partners are Home First, Path, Abode, and Life Moves. Specifically, all of our sites are low barrier entry, so we don't have sobriety requirements. We also allow pets, and we work with our operators to incorporate the feedback of our current program participants. One example that I like to highlight is our Guadalupe emergency interim housing site. We have had a working group comprised of people with experience of homelessness who have had input on the project from its design, from layout to colors at the site, all the way through to reviewing the operating plan and providing their feedback on how the program is actually going to run day to day. And then our sites also have very rich on-site supportive services, all with the primary outcome of transitioning participants to permanent housing. So this is probably the number one cost of all of our operating budgets is really the people who take care of our most vulnerable people in our community. And so we're really in the process of trying to handle how we keep a high level of service and a high level of support, because we know that's what moves people onto permanent housing. And how do we kind of lower costs or try and braid in different funding sources? So for example, we're looking at how we potentially braid in CalAIM as a funding source. Next slide. So here's some client exit data from our interim housing sites. About half of people who leave our interim housing sites are going to a permanent housing destination, and another 19% are going to other temporary or transitional housing, which we view as a success. For example, someone may leave and our interim housing site, and they may leave to go to a treatment program. And we consider that a success. That's the next step in their journey to permanent housing, and it's not an exit or a return to homelessness, which is something we don't want to see. Next slide. So here's a sample of some of our operating costs. And I wanted to point out one, these are not all of our sites, but it's kind of what fits nicely on a slide. But there are definitely economies of scale that are achievable with density. So you may see the first two rows, Mayberry and Felipe, have a higher operating costs, and that we correlate that primarily to the low number of beds. So for example, you still need a on-site manager, right? Whether the site is 35 beds or whether the site is 96 beds. So there are some economies of scale, again, that we see with just having more density on site. And so that is certainly a lesson learned. And all of our sites that are newer under construction are typically 100 beds. We're starting to now go even beyond that. Our Home Key site with Life Moves at Branham and Monterey is 200 beds. So we are definitely going more towards more and more density for our sites. Next slide. Okay, and lastly, I just wanted to leave everyone with some regional resources. So Homebase is a consultancy firm with expertise in homelessness. They're our consultant for our region's continuum of care. We, the city, have used them to study our own interim housing. And their study of San Jose's interim housing was primarily focused on data from our current customers and also feedback from our current operators. And then Homebase also did a more kind of regional study of interim housing, and I put the link here on this slide, but they do, in that study, have a few kind of high-level best practices that you can see here around privacy, rooms with lockable doors. That was really something we heard a lot from our own customers in San Jose, how much that meant to them to have their own private space and a place where they could feel grounded and stable and be able to focus on kind of what is next for them on their journey. Next slide. And then I did want to point you all to All Home, which has some resources and best practices for interim housing. I included a website, but they also prioritize privacy, supportive services, site management, and really flexible lengths of stay for interim housing. And that is the end of my presentation, and I'm hoping we can just have a robust discussion around interim housing.
Oh, Matthew, I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ragan. We really appreciate that. Could somebody from the SV at Home team copy out the All Home link and put it in the chat for folks? That'd be great. Ragan, thank you so much again for coming. We have a great group of folks that are interested in learning more, and I think you gave us a really great overview. I want to start with some follow-up questions, and we'll be taking some questions out of the chat. We really appreciate how you're laying out the role of interim housing as part of this continuum of the supportive housing system and the continuum of care. And I think there's a pretty solid consensus that this is a critical piece of that comprehensive approach. And so we really appreciate that. I'm wondering though how we balance the relative needs. We're focused today on interim. I know you have, the broader picture as well. So how do we balance out? We know that there are prevention needs, the interim temporary needs to respond to the crisis that people are in the moment, and then the permanent housing that we're trying to get people connected to. How do we work to sustain this balance right now in the city?
Thanks, Matthew. That's something we're definitely struggling with in San Jose. We do have a local measure called Measure E, and we use a portion of that for our interim housing, but we also need to use that for permanent housing. And so we're definitely struggling with that balance. That organization I mentioned, All Home, they have a framework for homeless solutions. They call it the 1-2-4 framework. So for every one investment a city or a county makes in interim housing, they should also be making 2 investments in permanent housing and 4 investments in homelessness prevention. San Jose, we haven't exactly been following the 1-2-4 framework, but I just wanted to share that as a kind of a best practice that All Home has put out there as a way for cities to try and find that balance of the immediate and also, keeping our foot on the gas on the permanent solutions as well.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that a little bit, I think, if we have time. I know there are some questions about that. San Jose's clearly been a leader in this space and really moving ahead with developing these sites. I know because we've been watching carefully for the last 5 or 6 years that it is a process to identify the sites. And I wonder if you could talk, as we have so many people from all over the region who are interested in how this works, a little bit about how the sites are selected and identified and move forward. We know that some of this work, or a lot of it, happens under the authority of the Shelter Crisis Declaration that dates back to 2015. We know there were, additional siting powers that we had during the pandemic that were used as part of this process. So could you talk a little bit about how the process has worked, what some of the factors are that you think have been key in identifying sites and overcoming challenges? In the small print in one of your slides, I know at one point we had our entire city council committed to having at least one site in their districts, and I don't think we've achieved that. So if you could talk a little bit about that process and what we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, when we really started on ramping up interim housing, the city first started with our own property. What are our kind of remnant parcels? What do we own? What's viable? And so we had some basics like ideally a site that's 2 acres, ideally a site that's not located on a floodplain, for example, or a site that's buildable, doesn't have big dips or partly located on like a freeway off-ramp. So we really scoured and really combed through all of our city-owned sites. We feel like we built on what we could. So we did build on a city-owned site. That's our Burnham and Bernal and Monterey. I'm getting all my sites confused, but that's a city-owned site, and it looks like it's almost on an overpass, I guess, as you're getting onto Bernal. And that's our smallest site. I think it's less than 2 acres. And then we started to look to some of our partners. So for example, VTA and Caltrans, on what sites they might have for us to use. As I mentioned, that kind of it adds a little bit of time to a project because you have to negotiate with another entity about the use of their land and typically have some kind of lease agreement with them. Although I will say Caltrans and VTA have been really great partners with us on our interim housing efforts. And as you mentioned, Mathew, there was some initial council direction, I think back in 2018, 2019, around having one interim site in every council district. But as you're looking at either city-owned land or other public partner-owned lands, your options become a little bit limited in terms of having one in each council district. Although we certainly try, VTA might not have a site that's available in District 1, for example. So we haven't been able to achieve that one site per council district. But I will say that every site we've brought forward, council has approved. We've had great policymakers in the city of San Jose who have, even in the face of neighborhood opposition, have said, this is a crisis and we need as many solutions as we can in our community.
Okay, so looking for underutilized sites, sort of already controlled by a public entity that can.
That was really our strategy.
Yeah, I know it's been a lot of work, and it, as you kind of come up against moving through that list, the next ones are more of a challenge. So we appreciate that. I think it's important though for folks to know that was the emphasis, to look at publicly owned sites first, because we're seeing different, particularly the home key doesn't always follow the same models. So part of the progress you've made has been based on really diving in and leveraging those public sites. Does that sound right?
Yeah, as I mentioned, anytime you're leasing or purchasing land from a private entity, you're adding costs and you're adding time. And
we are getting some questions about that. Let me jump into those. So
sure,
we know that the construction costs are varying a lot too, over time and across sites. Could you talk a little bit about what the differences are? You talked a little bit about some of the resources that were coming in. But I think in the last round, the Cerrone site was estimated, because it was leased land in part, at about $200,000 per bed. Is that kind of where we're at in the process right now?
Yeah, so we've seen costs escalate in the last 1 to 2 years, I would say, just with the cost of materials. And this is a reality not just for interim housing. It's a reality for permanent affordable housing. It's a reality for market rate housing. Yeah. Like the cost of a piece of wood is the cost of a piece of wood, and you're paying the same, again, whether you're building market rate or affordable or interim.
Are there other things that change the cost? I know that some places
they're
putting kitchenettes in, and we've been looking at, you all have been working hard to figure out if it's shared bathrooms versus, bathrooms that are in the unit. Are things like that impacting the construction costs significantly?
It can for sure be a cost driver. We've tried to address that with some private philanthropic partners. So one example is our Guadalupe interim housing site. The cost that the city paid was about $7.5 million. Doesn't include a $5 million donation we had on that site for modular units. So that cost would have been much higher for us had we had to pay that cost for the modular units. And we had a similar cost savings at our Evans Lane site where we had about 2 million in modular units donated. So where we can do that, we certainly try. We're looking at doing that same thing at the Cerrone site, having some private philanthropic partners on that site as well.
Great. So it's really leveraging all of the different federal, state, local, philanthropic, public land to make this work. And they are varying both over time and in terms of the amenities in the units and the site. I think that's valuable because we think of these as one thing. Some of us visualize sheds, tough sheds, and other people visualize a whole suite with a full, but they vary a lot, and that has an impact on the costs. Okay, let's talk about the other part of the cost that you brought up, which is the ongoing operating costs. This has been a major focus in San Jose, and as you said, one of the real challenges, and you pointed out, can be as much as $25,000 to $50,000 per bed per year. And I know that even with the tremendous effort that your team and the city manager's office and the mayor's office have done to bring in additional resource, the estimate last year was that after all of this and a significant piece of the multiple affordable housing development funding sources, we're still looking at $38 million out of the general fund for this year, with an estimate of going up to about 70 million by 28, 29. So what are the determining factors? How do we move forward? What are the things that are shaping the ongoing costs? And do we have a direction on
Yeah.
how to pay for these ongoing costs?
Yeah, we are like knee deep in this right now, as the city's entering our next budget cycle for next fiscal year. We're pretty transparent with our costs. So every year we do, as part of our budget process, we publish a 10-year forecast that has all of our interim sites, the cost to operate, the sources to fund it, and where the gaps might be. And if I can find last year's, I'll pop it in the chat. We're right now, as we speak, working on the updated forecast that will be part of our budget process this spring for council to deliberate on. We are trying to drive costs down where we can, but as I mentioned, that's really hard to do if we still want to maintain that outcome of moving people to permanent housing, because the people that do that are our on-site operators, our partners, the people that are on site every day, Home First, Life Moves, Abode, Path, who are really caring for our most vulnerable community members. And we really can't ask them to do more with less. So it's a really tricky balance, and we're trying to see where we can kind of braid in creative funding sources. So one thing I mentioned was the possibility of braiding in some CalAIM money at our sources, at some of our sites. That's a fairly new state funding source where our managed healthcare plans in San Jose can help fund shelter beds for people who are leaving institutions, whether that's jail, a hospital, a treatment center, and they need a temporary place to stay, though CalAIM can pay for that. We're also looking at partnering with the county and our housing authority about how we kind of braid our own resources together and move to how the county operates interim housing, where they're taking people from our coordinated entry queue, people who are experiencing homelessness right now, but they have an exit path for example, we know they're going to move to a permanent supportive housing unit and they need this temporary place to stay. The county can come in with some supportive services help, and the housing authority, under their move to work authority, they can also provide a temporary operating subsidy. So we're trying to look at models like that
No,
as a way
that's a really
to kind
good
of
segue, Reagan. I
be
understand
creative.
yeah, I understand how complicated it is, and I know that a lot of us are watching to figure out how we can all be part of the process of figuring out how to make sure that we can
Yeah.
sustain this
There's
commitment.
definitely no magic solution, right? And especially as really the federal government really isn't paying for shelters or interim housing anymore. The state has helped with the HAP money and home key money, but neither of those sources are ongoing sources. And
Right.
so I think we collectively as a region can advocate together for continuing those funding sources, because we see the impact they have right here in our own community by paying for both the construction and the operations of interim housing.
Good. I know we have some questions about the experience of the residents, and I think that's really important. This is clearly, an effort to get folks relief from the crisis of folks living on the street, structuring support, programming services, eventually finding permanent housing. And in some ways, the experience of the stay is the goal once people are brought in, but it's after the stay that really measures our success. And I think you laid that out a little bit in the slide in terms of the exits. So I'm wondering if we know a little bit more about how the pieces are fitting together. In your slide, you had exited to temporary housing and exited to permanent housing. And I'm wondering if we know a little bit more about what this means. I'll just tell you there's some other information being collected, I believe in some county sites that are showing that, up to 85% of the people moving to permanent housing are moving to other supported, subsidized housing. And that the folks moving into temporary solutions are often hopefully going back to more stable spaces with sort of friends and families or other interim shelters, which are, kind of moving people back into stability, but still in that system of being unhoused. So do you have a breakdown of where people are going when they are finding permanent housing? Are people moving back into the private market? Are they primarily moving into subsidized housing? And, again, going back to that original question of how does that fit with our balance of investment and commitment in order to make this system work?
Yeah, we do ask, all of our partners ask when an individual is leaving the site where their destination is. I don't have today for you, Mathew, like the breakdown of like who went to temporary or transitional housing. Did they go to a substance use treatment facility or another kind of transitional housing program? I don't have that breakdown today, but we do track. And we also, as you mentioned, we do track if someone is going to a family reunification. Maybe they've made amends with family and they're able to move back in with relatives. We do track that as well.
Okay. I think that's real important for us because, again, as you said, it's part of this. How do we make sure we're keeping the system functioning by having the pieces working together? So at the county level, and at least a couple of the sites that they had studied, it was about 85% of the people moving out into permanent housing, not back with friends or other interim housing. We're moving into other subsidized units, like you said, this sort of pathway into permanent supportive housing.
I would say our data varies because our interim housing model is not the same as the county's.
Right.
So the county has a much higher success rate of people who are moving into permanent housing because they're taking individuals from our coordinated entry system who already have that predetermined location. We're taking people in San Jose directly from encampments that have no predetermined location or housing solution, which again is why having the on-site supportive services is so important in San Jose's model, is because we're taking individuals of all abilities and disabilities and having the on-site staff who can care for a wide range of abilities and disabilities is really important. And again, really hard to ask our nonprofits to kind of do more with less when they are caring for our most vulnerable community members.
Yep. It's real work. We really appreciate the work that's happening. I think everybody is recognizing how much progress is being made at creating opportunities for folks that didn't exist. And there's a bunch of questions in the chat, and I know we're going to have this discussion during the budget season again about how we're investing in sustaining these commitments that we've made and how they fit into the continuum. So I appreciate that. We have a question about, and I don't know if you can answer this, that one of the challenges of sort of taking that step out and exiting the sites is how just the challenges that we know exist in the market, and that there are barriers to entry that are both financial, down payment, lack of options, and that there's it's intimidating, and that it can lead to refusal of placement. Ideally, we're creating a kind of a structure and an anchor for folks to plug into those. Is that something you all have identified in these kind of management reviews of really supporting people in that exit? And what are some of the challenges that you found?
Definitely.
Sorry to bug you. Can you go to your Teams and see?
What you mentioned, Mathew, just about there's a scarcity of truly affordable units in our community, and it can definitely be daunting to try and work with an individual who's maybe not connected with a subsidy or a permanent supportive housing unit. But I will say across our system, there's about 12% of people who are able to find a permanent housing solution without a subsidy. And there's another 10% who leave homelessness for, again, that family reunification or living with friends and family. I think for San Jose, we support those options through our nonprofit operators. The city like to have in our agreements with our operators, we have what we call direct client assistance, where that's a pot of money that we really want our operators to use to help remove barriers to someone achieving permanent housing. So do they need that help with deposits? Is there some kind of intervention or support we could provide to have an individual reunite with family? We have paid for bus or plane transportation to help an individual reunite with family. And we just verify that there's a family member on the receiving end who has indeed told us that they are accepting that individual. So we really try and provide that support again through our operators and making sure they have that direct client assistance funding where we can kind of remove those barriers to permanent housing.
Great. I think it helps explain some of the ongoing costs, right? The investment in people to really make this work is serious. And And I think it's just helpful to elevate that. So I appreciate that. We are getting pretty close to closing. There was a question about rapid rehousing. I think there's a lot of different programs that end up coming into play with multiple funding sources. Clear takeaway for me is this: you couldn't underestimate how complicated this is, and we really appreciate all of the work that you all are doing to keep it moving. Do you have any last words before we wrap up and go on to closing our time today?
Just thank you, SB at Home, for having me. You know, San Jose, we're not doing it perfectly. We're learning as we go. We couldn't do it without our community partners and Life Moves and Home First and Abode and Path and many others. And it is complicated, but please consider the city of San Jose or even our nonprofit partners as resources for other cities in the region who might be thinking about interim housing.
Absolutely. And we will be sharing a copy of this discussion, a recording of this discussion with folks that registered. It'll be posted on our website, is on our YouTube channel as we speak. And we'll definitely put the links in for additional resources in the follow-up email, along with a description of our call to action. Policy in Action really likes to close with a sense of direction on the next steps. And as we've been talking about, this next part of the process is to figure out how we make sure we can sustain the commitments that we've made. And really importantly for us at home, how we make sure that we're continuing our investments in the continuum, that we know the goal is to get folks into safe, stable housing that they can afford. And that often means investing in affordable housing development so we have places for people to go as they move through this process. So the budget season is starting in San Jose. We're expecting in about 2.5 weeks the mayor to release the initial budget message, and there will be ongoing engagement through June. So in our follow-up email, we'll give you a little bit of an overview of some of what to expect. And we are definitely going to need to be part of that process as a community, particularly in San Jose, but really our efforts to address the problem in San Jose and make sure we can sustain our commitments across that continuum are going to have an impact on the whole region. So we're super excited to kick off that process and promise opportunities to further engage. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey, who is going to pull back up SV at Home slides and talk a little bit more about what we're doing and how you can get involved organizationally in SV at Home. Okay, I will take over. Please stay connected to us. We are on Instagram, we are on LinkedIn, we are on Twitter. We have a lot of resources on our site. You can scan the QR code or go to Silicon Valley at home.org and find out more about what we're doing. We also are a membership organization, and your support supports our ability to continue to provide what I think hopefully is a very robust discussion here with experts who are at the center of doing the work like Ragan. And so we do urge you all to become a member. I see that somebody put the direct link in the chat. Please take advantage of that. This is how we build the strength that we have as a movement of folks committed to addressing the housing crisis that we're experiencing. And so we urge you and invite you into being part of that collective effort. by becoming a member and supporting our efforts to bring people together. I think with that, we are done. The policy in action is something that we do every month on the fourth Friday of each month. And so please look forward to hearing more going forward. We really want to make sure that we're being responsive to what you're interested in and that we're doing a good job of presenting information that is useful to you all and substantive. So in just a second, you will see that a survey will pop up on screen, and there are 3 quick questions that we always include at the end of these events that we really use to inform our work going forward. So we really would appreciate folks filling in the survey. And with that, thank you again for coming. We're excited to see you next month. Looking ahead, mark your calendar, block off the entire month of May because it is Affordable Housing Month, and we're going to have a tremendous amount of additional programming that we're looking forward to sharing with you all. So thank you all for coming. And with that, we'll let you go.